I'm Hilary Putnam, and I'm Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, where I taught for 40 years. I started in philosophy of science. Also did logic, but I did the logic I did largely in mathematics departments. On the philosophical side, I was first known as a philosopher of science, but then also as a philosopher of language. That goes in part back to my undergraduate career. In college, I had the equivalent of 3 majors. I took all the courses in 3 subjects: philosophy, German, and linguistic analysis. And that was the first program under the name linguistic analysis in the world. I was at the University of Pennsylvania between 1944 and 1948. And so I had this interest in linguistics from way back. So philosophy of language became my second big subject. Then starting in the late 50s, I don't know what year, but I was still at Princeton. I wrote a paper called Minds and Machines, analogizing human minds to computers, which became very influential. That started a program called Functionalism in the philosophy of mind. So then had 3 specialties: philosophy of science, philosophy of language, and philosophy of mind. And then after the Vietnam War, really, when I became dissatisfied with philosophy that was so remote from what John Dewey called the problems of men, by which he meant the problems of human beings, not the problems of males, I got more interested in the foundations of ethics, not specific questions about what to do, but what sort of judgments are ethical judgments. And I'm still writing on that. I would say those interests are interests that grew directly out of my reading and teaching the American pragmatists. I suppose I'm a naturalist in John Dewey's sense. That is, I don't want to use appeals to supernatural entities in philosophy. But the trouble is the word naturalism got hijacked by what used to be called materialists. There's a perfectly good word, materialism. And I don't know, because now someone like myself, who's an anti-reductionist, is an anti-naturalist in the sense of being against this kind of reductionism, but not an anti-naturalist in John Dewey's sense. When Carnap, a man I love, it struck me what he writes about poetry or art. He said, well, these are important because they evoke images and feelings. This is not the way, for me, this is not the way you talk about Proust or any work of art that you happen to love. If all you say, well, it evokes images and feelings, I wonder whether you've read the same novel I've read. I think philosophers of all people, and the great philosophers, I think, were in the tradition. I mean, Aristotle, after all, wrote the Poetics, right? The first great work of aesthetics, as well as works on logic, on ethics, on metaphysics, on psychology. Kant held about 6 chairs at Königsberg. He did turn down the chair of poetry, which was offered to him. Hume wrote a great history of England and was a superb stylist. I mean, if philosophers narrow themselves, they try to divide up the field, both the things you talked about, when I complained about separating, not being able to see that similar problems might arise in philosophy of mathematics and metaethics, and what we're talking about now, sensibility or temperament. These are, for me, connected, and that I think philosophers, because we are kibitzers after all, let's face it, there are no Nobel Prizes in philosophy, and there shouldn't be. As kibitzers, we better know what we're kibitzing. And that means we better have an idea of the different sides of people's lives. Well, for me, the sense in which I've always been a realist, I made one stab in what I think is the wrong direction called internal realism around 1980, which was really the beginning of my attempt to give more room for ethics in my philosophy, to be more of a realist about ethics. And I think I did it the wrong way then, but it was the impulse is one which is still very much with me. But even then, however, I've always felt that, look, we live in a world, idealism and positivism, what's called phenomenalism, the idea that everything we're really talking about is what sensory experiences we have when, can't be right, because we live in a world in which human beings are a very, very tiny part. That there is a physical universe out there. We are a very, very tiny part of that. Our experiences, whatever their ultimate nature may be, transactional, whatever, are a very, very small part of the goings on in the world. And for that, as it were, gut reason, I've never been able to accept instrumentalism. Instrumentalism saying what we're really talking about is a tiny fraction of what there is out there to talk about. So in that sense, I call myself, and I've always called myself, a scientific realist. I became interested in philosophy in high school and was reading a popular book, Will Durant's Story of Philosophy. And there's something I feel guilty about is I never wrote Will Durant a fan letter. I felt sometime after becoming a Harvard professor, I really should have written Will Durant a fan letter and saying, it's your book that turned me on to philosophy. And I think we need something like that now. I don't know if there's that kind of writing out there that would make a kid in high school pick it up and say, oh, gee, these philosophers are pretty neat. I mean, I didn't go to college intending to be a philosopher. I thought I wanted to be a writer, and I majored in German because, which of course was all Jewish refugees. This was during World War II, because my father knew just about every language in the world, but he didn't like German. So at least taking a language, he wasn't all over, so to speak. But I don't think you have to necessarily come into philosophy looking for arguments or fascinated with arguments. It was that these philosophers had such imaginative worldviews. They raised possibilities that had never crossed my mind. And that's still what I admire about Kant or Hegel or Spinoza. I'm a fallibilist. When I try to say exactly what fallibilism is, I'm always dissatisfied. The problem is this: if you say, well, fallibilism is, a crude statement, well, any statement at all that we believe might turn out to be false. Well, I don't believe it. Could 2 + 2 = 4 turn out to be false? I mean, I don't even know what that would be, right? So, and if you say, well, there are other things such we couldn't know. We said we couldn't know what it would be for them to turn out to be false, and they turned out to be false. That seems to be bad. That's an old skeptical argument, right? And the skeptic would want you to conclude that you don't know that you're in America, or you don't know you're speaking English, or you don't know you have a 1-year-old daughter, Philip. So I don't like these sorts of arguments. I mean, I think there's a deep truth in fallibilism, but stating it exactly right, so it doesn't endorse the sort of skeptical principle that if you've ever been wrong about anything, then you might be wrong about your name, having one head and not 2 heads, etc. That's for me is the problem. Crudely put, I would say that no human body of knowledge and no human institution is infallible. That seems to me a pretty safe way to put it. And then we can argue about how exactly to formulate fallibilism. Certainly scientific propositions are not infallible. Science thrives on fallibilism, and empirical science thrives on fallibilism. That's become part of one of its defining characteristics. Peirce says somewhere, and maybe this connects with when it's right, when it's wrong, that sometimes he's extremely fallibilist, but other times he says, well, there are common sense propositions which are infallible, but only by being extremely vague. The price you pay for certainty is that if something's going to be certain, it better be pretty vague. And I like that. I don't know what the big questions in philosophy are, but I know that for me now, the idea that values, the fact-value dichotomy, since I would say since 1976, really, my idea that the fact-value dichotomy is the really dangerous legacy of logical positivism, which means not just that there's a difference between factual judgments and so-called factual judgments and so-called value judgments. Sure, there's a difference, although not one difference, or differences, depending on which quotes value judgment and which quotes factual judgment you're talking about. But the so-called fact-value dichotomy or distinction has really become a thesis, the thesis that values are subjective. And that's an example of a thesis that started in pure philosophy and then came to have an enormous impact first on economists who are not uninfluential, by the way. I mean, as I point out in my book, The Collapse of the Fact-Value Dichotomy, Lord Lionel Robbins, who was at that time maybe the most influential economist in the world, opposed welfare, redistribution of income at the heart of the Depression, the Great Depression of 1929, on the grounds that interpersonal comparisons of utility were meaningless, and anyway that presupposes value judgments, and value judgments are outside the scope of rational argument. So we're talking here about a case where the problem with just giving up on philosophy is bad philosophy is omnipresent. You know, if we professional philosophers gave up talking about philosophy, your novelists wouldn't, your physicists wouldn't, your biologists wouldn't, your self-promoted God knows what wouldn't. And we would be deluged in nonsense. We will be deluged in nonsense, but at least there have to be some still small voices, like the boy saying the emperor has no clothes, saying that's nonsense, you know. And that rests on a whole bunch of debatable or false assumptions. And don't take that as self-evident. And so there, at least in our time, I think, and this is something that why Dewey is one of my major heroes. I think the idea that there can be responsible inquiry into value questions, but without being a reversion to fundamentalism or reversion to a priori philosophy. This is why I say that Dewey is, for me, the beginning or the hope or promise of what I call a third enlightenment. The first being Plato in the Euthyphro or in the Republic, the second being the enlightenment of the Lumiere, the 17th century, 18th century. But I think Dewey is trying to create a more fallibilistic enlightenment than the 18th century enlightenment or the Platonic enlightenment. One more in keeping with what he called the democratic faith. I believe in purely intellectual questions. You know, what to say, you know, what the heck is going on in set theory still fascinates me. One of the hardest intellectual questions there is, what the heck is going on in quantum mechanics? And I think that philosophy is only healthy when it simultaneously investigates questions of pure intellectual interest, or that seem, at least at the time, to have only a purely intellectual interest, and questions which obviously have immense practical importance at a particular time. That was what Plato did, that's what Aristotle did, that's what Kant did, that's what Dewey did. And you know, that is my model. We needn't be ashamed of investigating a question which has no practical importance, like the foundations of set theory or the foundations of quantum mechanics, but we can't only be doing that.